RetroFighters is a company that is designing or has designed modern controllers for your favorite retro systems. This was their first controller, the Jab NES controller, which had its weaknesses, and we'll get into that later. But after this controller, they then designed the Brawler 64, which was really popular because it's a modern take on the N64 controller, because a lot of people did not like the original design. But now Retrobit is back and they're doing a Sega version of this Brawler controller, and I'd like to take a look at it today and express why I think it might not be as popular as what Retrobit is doing. Alright, before we get into the topic of today, I'd like to say don't forget to let me spend my money so you don't waste yours by hitting the subscribe button. And if you want to keep informed on new videos I am uploading, do click the bell. You know, the same speech I give every time. Nonetheless, we're looking at RetroFighters, company that designs modern looking controllers for your favorite retro systems. And the first controller, as I said, that they came out with was the Jab NES controller. Now this controller can be used on your NES, your PC, and your Mac via the dual link cable, which has a USB and an original NES connector attached to it. And this controller was pretty cool. I did you dumb mother a video on this controller, and that can be found at the top of the screen or in the description down below. This controller was a cool take on the NES controller. However, it had its weaknesses. Now on the NES, you had your two action buttons and the D-pad to start and select as well. But it also had these analogs and the bumper buttons and trigger buttons. Now most of that pretty much mirrored the A and B button, and your analog sticks mirrored the D-pad. Most of these buttons were pretty useless on the NES. When you hooked it to a PC, you could map some of these buttons to be utilized in other emulators for different retro systems, such as NES. There were 4 action buttons and the 2 bumper buttons, so the triggers on the back can be mapped to your X and Y. This controller has analog sticks, which is pretty pointless in my opinion. I mean, I guess you could use it for certain Saturn games or maybe even Dreamcast. It's kind of awkward to use the triggers as the action buttons, and other than that, there wasn't really any use for most of the buttons on this controller. Now, RetroFighters decided to skip a version of the NES controller, which I wish they wouldn't have done, but they went straight into the Brawler 64, which was a modern take on the N64 controller. Now, for most people, they hated the original N64 controller. Personally, I had no problem with it. I actually liked the design, but people had issues with it. So RetroFighters brought the Brawler 64. It had your analog stick here up in the right corner there. The original design had some defect where it would hit the actual bumper button up top, and people found that annoying. Now apparently they fixed this. I personally never owned this controller. This is a decent controller. It feels really comfortable in the hands, as I've heard. Now they did also come out with these color versions. This is the red version, and here are the 5 colors. You had blue, purple, red, orange, and green. I was pretty upset to find out that they decided not to come out with a smoked gray version of this controller, or even a black translucent version, because my N64 is a smoked gray. Now, beyond those 2 controllers, RetroFighters is working on something different now, which will release in June, and that is a Sega Genesis / Mega Drive / Sega Saturn controller. And don't get me wrong, it looks pretty cool. I'm not entirely fond of this empty space here. It's the same design for the most part that RetroFighters has been using. It does have your 6 action buttons, which can be used on some games for the Genesis and mostly used for the Sega Saturn. You have your start and select, and I believe it's just 2 bumper buttons. I don't know if there are actually trigger buttons on here. Here are some other pictures of it. As you can see, this looks like there is an L and R button and no actual triggers, just bumper buttons. Now, where the analog stick is going to come in handy, because the original Sega Saturn controller didn't have an analog stick. They had, I forget what it's called, but it was, I guess, the 3D controller that was bundled with Nights into Dreams, which was my favorite game. That analog stick can be utilized on there, and I think there were a couple other games that might have utilized that analog stick. Now, my thing with this controller is, yes, I'm probably going to get this because, as you've seen, I am really fond of controllers. I do a lot of videos on different controllers and accessories. I don't think that it's going to be as popular as what Retrobit is doing, which they have partnered, as we all know, with Sega, and they're bringing back retro style controllers for the Genesis and the Sega Saturn. And one of the ones that I really want to get is that translucent blue. Now, these are wireless, and they're also, I think you can get them in USB or the original Genesis or Sega Saturn connectors. The one that I'm really interested in is this one back here, which is the Sega Saturn with, as you can see, analog sticks on both sides. I know you can't see it in the picture here. You can actually see it off to the side here. I'm interested in that, but I don't know if that controller actually has both bumper and trigger. I think it's just going to be bumper buttons, which is kind of upsetting because it would have been cool if it was like the 8-bit do NES controller that had the analog sticks and both bumper and trigger. I think that people are going to be more drawn to this Retrobit than they're actually going to be drawn to this Brawler Gen controller. Now, I can be wrong. That's just my opinion. I will be getting both and probably a couple of these controllers. What might draw some people to the Brawler Gen is that this is a dual link cable, which has your original Genesis connector, and which is also the same connector that works with the Sega Saturn, and it has USB. So if you're wanting to use this controller on both systems, this controller has a wire for both. All right, final thoughts. I think that the RetroFighters Brawler Gen controller is kind of cool. It's nice to always have the dual link cable. I've always liked that. I know Retrobit has done that as well, and I think also Hyperkin might have. Does apparently have an ergonomic design. I know the Jab controller did, and it did feel comfortable in the hands. It's nice that the Brawler Gen has a mode where you can switch for the 6-button layout or the 3-button combination layout. It's also kind of cool that this controller works on both the Sega Genesis, Mega Drive, and also the Sega Saturn, whereas the Retrobit controllers will only work on either or, and you'd have to get multiple controllers for that. So people might be drawn to this one because of that fact alone. However, I think a lot of people are going to want to get these controllers because they're closer in style to your original hardware controllers, and a lot of people like that nostalgic feel to them. The Brawler's Gen controller is a pretty decent looking controller. I definitely will be getting one. I definitely will probably test it on Sega Saturn and Genesis, probably the Mega SG whenever I finally get one. This controller is up for pre-order on their website. It does release on June 10th. If you have any questions, which I'm sure you won't, leave all that in the comments down below. Anything featured in this video, of course, will be in the description down below, so you can go ahead and check those out. And let me know in the comments down below also how you feel about this Brawler Gen. Are you going to end up getting this controller over the Retrobit controllers? If you liked what was contained in this video, as always, hit the thumbs up. Do consider sharing amongst friends and the rest of your social media. And as always, don't forget to let me spend my money so you don't waste yours by hitting that subscribe button.